sad little serenade, song of my heart's composing. I hear it still, guess I always will. Best on the bill, charade.
Hello everyone, I am still alive and doing commentaries. I'll try to make this summary a bit short, but today's target is on a pretty long commentary chain. If I could give you what you need to know, Keyblade Master did a commentary on Azrael 101 upgraded last year, then Umbrus made a commentary that covered various videos this year, with one of them being on Keyblade's commentary, or more specifically the portion where he criticized Azrael 101's intro skit. Key wasn't happy with that and made a response towards it, and Umbrus made a response that I had several issues with. So with that out of the way, let's get started.
Oh, theater! Kinda makes you wonder what I'm gonna talk about, eh? So, wonder why I'm here. I wonder why there's a vanilla faggot who looks like an exact doppelganger of me. Many things I wonder. How to do a commentary, Azrael! Wait, what are you talking about? Have you looked at your upload schedule? The only thing that you posted in an entire fucking month is just 2 live streams. But why do we have to do commentaries again? Stop your theory drama. Get off of my screen now, you satanic unholy being that of pure destruction. Fighting! Wait, reverse Azrael. What are you doing here? Flygon Sammy. Wait, what? No, I can explain.
Oh, you better explain what's going on here, Flygon, because right now I'm looking at all this and screaming, what the actual shit is going on? Like, holy crap, where do I begin with describing how much of a fever dream this entire intro skit is? For starters, why exactly are you in a theater? Like, I get it's because of yourself, I mean totally different person, Flygon. We'll talk about their issues later. Forcing you to post a commentary on your channel, but like, why a theater exactly? Because it's not like the setting ties into the video you're covering. No, you're all just out of theater because Winnie the Pooh sent you here or something.
Am I the only one who finds this complaint to be really petty? Like, if you think about it, the theater does work since you can't imagine Azrael watching the video within the theater.
You know, this point would be pretty solid if it weren't for one insignificant detail. Azrael herself brings attention to the setting within her intro skit, so it wouldn't exactly be petty of me to question why Azrael's at the location if she herself fails to inform the audience on why she's at the current location.
But Key, you failed to notice how Azrael herself questioned why she was in the theater in the first place.
Oh, a theater! Kinda makes you wonder what I'm gonna talk about, eh? So, wonder why I'm here.
So yeah, it is petty for you to mention this because it's unimportant that doesn't affect Azrael's intro skit overall.
There are 3 big problems with this point. The first being that in your original video, Umbrus, you weren't saying, oh, Azrael was questioning why she was in the theater, so this doesn't debunk anything. But instead, you were saying, actually, the setting still works since you can assume Azrael went to the theater to watch Shiokami's video. To which Key brought up how Azrael never implied that to be the case, which made your initial point come off as an excuse since it's trying to make its justification for something that Azrael didn't write in the skit. So at the end of the day, your original point was still wrong, and the fact you don't acknowledge this comes off as you trying to act like you were still right by bringing up a completely different argument. Secondly, you claimed that Key's complaint was unimportant to the intro skit, yet the entire intro skit was framed around being in a theater. If you go out of your way to establish the setting only to make it completely arbitrary and unrelated to the rest of the video, then that would be a problem with the intro skit, since Azrael completely disregarded the entire place that the skit takes place in, which can make it hard to follow along with. Finally, Azrael going, why am I in a theater, is not an explanation since that question was still not answered by the end of the video.
Another thing I noticed is how you say Azrael acknowledged the setting was insignificant, which destroys your argument since insignificant implies that said detail was meaningless and not worth taking into consideration, which destroys your argument entirely.
So in other words, the main setting of Azrael's skit, the one she went out of her way to establish, is completely insignificant and unimportant to the skit itself. Which would mean Azrael essentially wasted time establishing something that didn't matter and would confuse the people who were expecting the setting to play a big part in the skit. Do you not realize how that's a problem with the skit's writing? Even if you were right, the fact Azrael threw her setting away the moment after she introduced it wouldn't debunk Key's point about how the skit would be hard to follow along to. But all of this is assuming that Azrael actually said the setting was insignificant, when that actually wasn't the case, since in the clip you yourself showed, Azrael says,
Oh, a theater! Kinda makes you wonder what I'm gonna talk about, eh?
She outright acknowledges that the setting could make the audience wonder what Azrael was going to talk about, which was not something she dismissed as being unimportant, like you're claiming. Also, this statement,
Another thing I noticed is how you say Azrael acknowledged the setting was insignificant,
completely contradicts this one.
but Key, you failed to notice how Azrael herself questioned why she was in the theater in the first place.
So, he failed to notice it, but he was also the one who acknowledged it in the first place. You can tell this commentary was made in one day.
why should it matter whether or not the setting ties in or not? I think the main issue at this point is that you don't really consider the most obvious way the setting could tie into the video.
It matters when you're trying to connect the story into your intro skit, considering without a proper explanation as to why the person is at the current location, it comes off as lazy writing, considering you didn't write an important piece of information for your skit. Which, for someone who says later on in the video that she's a writer, it's pretty important to not leave this kind of stuff out. Also, saying I didn't consider the most obvious way the setting could have tied into the video without actually explaining what that way even is. Which, if this is the most obvious way, clearly Ireland must have a completely separate meaning for the word obvious.
Going for what Azriel told me while I was making this commentary, the Shio Kami video has no story, so it doesn't link with any previous commentary she made, so your point about there being reasons as to why the characters are here is kinda wrong.
That's funny, because your point about how Azriel didn't attach these skits to her previous commentaries is also kinda wrong.
This counter goes up, and someone dies.
No, Amelia. She was in the 10th commentary special, and she was my best friend from the foster home.
This is why you should fact check what people tell you rather than just taking what they said at their word. But regardless, even if these skits aren't a part of an overarching story, that's not the problem here, since Key was specifically criticizing the skit for being poorly written. Well, unless you're trying to argue that an intro skit doesn't need to explain the setting if it's not a part of an overarching story, which I might have agreed with if Azriel wasn't trying to relate the theater setting to the video she's covering, since she expected the audience to get an idea of what she was going to talk about through said setting. And all of this is ignoring how skits can be considered stories as long as they have a beginning, middle, and end. And in Azriel's case, the commentary started off with Flygon forcing her to do a commentary, deciding to murder people every time Shiokami insulted Pentagrin, and ended with Azriel murdering all of her side characters.
Oh, I killed everyone. Well, I guess I can do some final thoughts.
So, yeah, this could still be considered a story. A dark comedy-focused story, but a story nonetheless.
Now yes, self-contained stories are a thing, but this commentary's quote-unquote story is more of a skit than anything. Also, Key, you're completely misunderstanding what I said here. What I was getting at is that the solution, that being the one you called Grey, would have been a pretty obvious way to tie the setting into the commentary. This kinda makes me question if you paid attention to the context clues provided, because you kinda misrepresent what someone was saying or flat out didn't notice it.
Actually, I think you were the one who wasn't paying attention, because...
Hell, your idea about her watching the video at the theater would have been a great way for her to incorporate the setting into the commentary. But she never does anything like that within her video, instead opting to kill a bunch of strangers.
Key outright said that while your solution was a good idea, it didn't excuse anything since Azriel never said anything like that. And if I can add something here, your theory would actually contradict Azriel's skit, since she stated clear as day she had no idea why she was in the theater. So either way, your little commentary theory is nowhere near as obvious as you're making it out to be.
Even then, you probably can just envision the idea I mentioned without any explanation from Azriel's end, because again, it's very obvious that Azriel would be watching the video in the theater.
So in other words, we could just pretend this theory you've brought up works even though it directly contradicts what Azriel said in the intro skit, and pretend that this somehow changes Key's point that it wasn't obvious. Umbrus, you are literally asking for people to pretend you're right. Come on.
Sure, you could just chalk this up to me looking too deep into an intro skit, but if your skit has me asking all these questions before you can even start the commentary, then that's not giving me a good sign for things to come.
Alright, so while on paper I understand the point about Flygon's voice being practically the same as Azriel, I don't think that's inherently an issue. If I were to list a few examples, Brain,
Okay, I'm gonna be playing the original footage of this video here since it's next to impossible to understand what Umbrus is saying. Here's some advice. If the target's footage is already sped up, then speeding it up more will make it a lot harder to hear.
Going into the production side of these characters, it's probably not the best idea to have characters that sound exactly like you. Like, I'm willing to give Reverse Azriel a pass since there's a bit of an audio effect in place to establish some difference from you, but Flygon, no distinction at all. Just making this all come off as you talking to yourself.
Alright, so while on paper I understand the point about Flygon's voice being practically the same as Azriel, I don't think that's inherently an issue. If I were to list a few examples, Stewie and Brain Griffin share the same voice actor, the Mario Brothers, and by extension the Wario Brothers, share the same voice actor, Jean-Pierre Polnareff and Risotto share the same voice actor, and I could go on and on and on about characters in the same show, movie, or game with the same voice actor. My point is that with characters like Jean-Pierre Polnareff and Risotto, they are essentially talking to themselves when they interact with each other.
I think you're missing the point of what I was trying to say, as I wasn't saying it's a problem for someone to voice two characters that are talking to one another. I was more so pointing out how Flygon and Azriel have the exact same voice as one another, which in all of your examples isn't an issue, considering that despite those characters being voiced by the same voice actor, they all have some differentiation to distinguish themselves from one another, such as Luigi having a much higher pitch than Mario, and Wario having a much lower pitch from Waluigi.
I want you to keep all of this in mind, but for now I'll attempt to argue this point. The way you worded your original point made it sound like you were saying having two characters with the same actor was a bad thing, when it inherently isn't an issue.
Alright, what was wrong with Key's wording? Oh, no explanation. Lovely. Especially since from what I've seen, it was pretty obvious he was referring to how distinct the characters were in their line delivery, and wasn't just complaining about how they were voiced by the same person. You can infer this from when he says,
It's probably not the best idea to have characters that sound exactly like you.
and how he gave Reverse Azrael a pass for having an audio effect.
Like, I'm willing to give Reverse Azrael a pass since there's a bit of an audio effect in place to establish some difference from you.
And how he got onto the Flygon character for having no distinction.
But Flygon, no distinction at all.
Since all of those are specifically referring to how the character's lines are delivered. Now I can guess how you misunderstood this due to the part where Key says,
Just making this all come off as you talking to yourself.
however, you're still ignoring every other piece of context in the sentence that shows he's talking about the line delivery, which means you're just not paying attention to the full point and are only looking at Key's sentence in a vacuum.
As I said with Polnareff and Risotto, the voice actor finds ways to distinguish themselves from each other when they're talking to themselves, which you basically go on to regurgitate, which makes this entire interjection feel pointless if I can be honest.
First of all, you're not one to get onto other people for repetition, considering how often you've been repeating the same points you made against Key in Miyamoto Crusaders, to the point where you restated the examples you used in this very interjection. And secondly, considering how you weren't paying attention to Key's full point, this clearly needed to be said again in order to help you understand what Key was actually saying.
Now yes, all the VAs do distinguish their voices depending on the character, and that definitely is something Azrael can do.
On second thought, I guess I didn't need to make my last interjection, considering you yourself pointed out what my main point was. Like, I'm about that how you write your point, then add something in that hurts the point you're trying to get across. What is this, a presidential debate? God help us all if it is.
Well then, I guess this just proves my previous point, since I question why you kept your previous interjection in, since when you cut back I say something that completely destroys your argument.
Actually, no it doesn't, because the fact your examples had more range than Azrael invalidated your comparison, since your point only works if the voice actors have range. And since Azrael doesn't, you're essentially admitting that your examples do nothing towards the complaints levied towards Azrael's skit.
If anything, my point was similar to the point you just made, and again, the way you phrased your original point made it sound like having a voice that is practically the same between two characters is a bad thing.
It really didn't.
I failed to see where you're coming from throughout this video.
Obviously, but it's not due to Key's wording.
But I don't see why it's a problem if Azrael and Flygon have the same voice, other than it has no filter. Now, before someone twists my words, yes, people don't always watch commentaries, and I am aware that those listening can get confused on who's supposed to be who. But even then, Key doesn't even elaborate on how Azrael can improve in this aspect.
So you say you don't see the problem with two characters having the same voice, immediately bring up a reason as to why that would be considered a problem, and then immediately handwave that point away because, ow, Key didn't elaborate on how to improve. Even if we ignore the fact that Key bringing up the possibility of audio filters would give Azrael an idea of how to fix this issue, you didn't provide a proper rebuttal to your counter-argument. So if the people who listen to commentaries as background noise would have a hard time following along to a skit where everyone sounds the same, then that would still be a problem with Azrael's skits.
Secondly, I don't elaborate on how Azrael can improve on this aspect. Umbrus, you do realize that sometimes there are times when the piece of critique can be pretty simple and not require that much elaboration. And I think the advice of don't have your characters sound exactly like you is one of those pieces of critique where, while elaboration is nice, the point is simple enough for someone to understand it without the elaboration.
Actually, that isn't entirely true, since Azrael mightn't necessarily know how to distinguish the voices of her characters from one another. You could have easily mentioned training her voice so she could do other voices, getting other people to voice the characters, doing what I did for Wilter and use text-to-speech, actually use filters.
Which was something that Key alluded to in his commentary on Azrael by saying that using audio effects was fine, but please, continue to blatantly ignore the parts of Key's statements that go against your points.
In terms of final thoughts, I don't necessarily have any, since Key is my favorite commentator and I don't exactly know how he could improve, since this was just an okay video at the end of the day. Think of this commentary like how I view my Critical Link video. I don't hate the video, but there are still issues with it. I will admit that the segment regarding you was flawed, but I still stand behind most of my points, since those flaws mainly come from me admittedly not being the best at wording things.
Yeah, when you said you stood behind most of your points, are you sure you don't mean all? Because for someone who thought Key's video was merely okay, you covered every single point he made against you, all the while reaffirming the points you made against him, and constantly claiming that Key was missing the point, or not paying attention, or had poor wording. On that note, considering that you tried to justify one of your points by going, oh, your point was badly worded, so I'm right, then it's rather funny since you admitted a good chunk of your original points were poorly worded. And since that's all established, we can now throw this logic back at you. Just saying, if you're gonna dismiss Key's points because of bad wording, then that standard applies to you too. Though since you never admitted anywhere else in this video that your points were badly worded, I wouldn't blame anybody for thinking that these final thoughts were really hollow. Now with that, the video is practically done, so if I can bring up the main reason I wanted to cover this, it's because the scripting process for Umbrus' commentary was interesting. You see, when Umbrus scripted this video, she threw it in a script chat in a Discord server I was in for people to check it. Bennett the Human, a friend of ours, looked over it and had massive issues with it, to the point where every one of Umbrus's points had at least one long comment attached to it. And in response, Umbrus deleted every one of their comments and proceeded to rush the video out, as evidenced by how it came out the day after the script was finished. Now, to be clear, I'm not doing this to expose Umbrus or cancel her or anything stupid like that. I get she's young, and I get accepting criticism is a skill that people learn through time. However, this is an issue I've seen happen now and again with other commentators that I think should be addressed. Where a commentator asks someone to look over their script, they bring up several problems with the points, and they just ignore the arguments they make and go with the commentary as planned. Granted, I'm not saying commentators need to blindly agree with every point made against them, that would be absurd. However, if you don't agree with the arguments that someone makes towards you in a script, at least talk with them about it before going through with the video, since ignoring your script checker's advice only guarantees you'll be hearing the same complaints later, whether it be from the script checkers themselves or someone else who happened to have the same problems as them. Can't imagine who, though.
Best on the bill, charade.